The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, casting the ancient kingdom of Eldamir into a dusky twilight as the villagers hurried to complete their evening chores before the night claimed the land entirely. The cobbled streets, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, echoed with the distant clatter of hooves as a lone rider made his way through the town, his cloak heavy with dust from the road. No one paid him much mind. Travelers were common in these parts, especially with the great trade road cutting through the heart of Eldamir, connecting the northern mines to the southern ports. But this rider was different, though none could yet say why. His name was Alistair Thornbrick, a historian of little renown, sent by the Royal Archives to document the fading legends of the countryside before they were lost to time. His task was tedious, his journey uneventful, and his writings, though thorough, were often dismissed as dry and uninspiring by those who preferred grand tales of war and romance. Yet tonight, as he dismounted outside the dimly lit inn known as the Weary Traveller, he carried with him a secret, a scrap of parchment so ancient it threatened to crumble at the slightest touch, its contents hinting at a forgotten chapter of history so dull, so painstakingly mundane, that it was said merely reading it could lull even the most restless soul into a deep and dreamless sleep. The innkeeper, a stout man with a permanently disinterested expression, barely glanced up as Alistair entered, muttering something about supper being served cold if he didn't hurry. With a sigh, the historian settled into a corner, unfurling the fragile parchment under the flickering candlelight, unaware that his discovery, though dreadfully boring, would soon become the key to unraveling the most sleep-inducing mystery the kingdom had ever known. Chapter 2. The parchment, as it turned out, was a tax record. Not just any tax record, but perhaps the most exhaustive, mind-numbingly detailed account of grain yields, livestock counts, and wool production ever meticulously compiled by the long-defunct Office of Royal Census under the reign of King Aldric the Forgettable, a monarch so unremarkable that even his court scribes struggled to recall his name without consulting their notes. The document spanned 17 pages of cramped, faded script, each line more monotonous than the last, detailing the annual contributions of every village in Eldamir over a span of 30 years. Alistair, despite his training in enduring such dry material, felt his eyelids grow heavy as he trudged through the third page, which listed, in excruciating specificity, the exact number of turnips harvested in the hamlet of Willowbrick in the year 742. Yet something nagged at him, a discrepancy so slight it would have escaped any but the most dedicated scholar. On page 12, between the records of barley quotas and the inventory of copper pennies paid in lieu of labor, there was a single line out of place, a reference to a Vault of Eternal Repose, a site not mentioned in any other surviving text. The words were smudged, as if someone had tried to erase them, but the ink had stubbornly lingered. Alistair rubbed his temples, fighting the urge to doze off right there at the table, but duty compelled him to press on. If this vault existed, it was no grand treasury or hidden tomb, it was, according to the context, a storage facility for outdated ledgers. And yet, the way it was mentioned, almost as an afterthought, suggested it held something far more soporific than old paperwork. The historian's quill scratched across his notebook as he jotted down his thoughts, the sound blending with the distant drone of a barmaid reciting the evening's menu to a half-asleep patron. The mystery, such as it was, would have to wait for morning. For now, the weight of the parchment's contents was too much to bear, and Alistair's head drooped onto the table, the candle sputtering out as the inn's occupants succumbed, one by one, to the irresistible pull of sleep. Chapter 3. Dawn came sluggishly to Eldamir, the sky a dull grey as if even the sun couldn't muster the energy to rise properly. Alistair awoke with a stiff neck and the distinct taste of candle wax in his mouth, the tax record still pressed beneath his cheek, its words now slightly smeared from drool. The inn was quiet, save for the occasional snore from a corner where a merchant had fallen asleep mid-meal, his spoon still clutched in his hand. Alistair groaned, stretching his arms before carefully rolling up the parchment and tucking it into his satchel. The mention of the Vault of Eternal Repose had lingered in his dreams, manifesting as a vast, windowless chamber filled with endless shelves of identical books, each one more boring than the last. He needed to find out if it was real, and if so, where it was hidden. The Royal Archives had no record of such a place, which either meant it was a clerical error, a thrilling prospect, given the context, or it had been deliberately omitted. His first stop was the town's decrepit library, a musty building that smelled of mildew and forgotten knowledge. The librarian, a wisp of a woman who seemed to have been born among the stacks, regarded him with bleary eyes as he inquired about the vault. "Oh, that," she said, her voice as dry as the parchment in his bag. "Nobody asks about that. It's where they kept the records too dull for the main archives. Ledgers, crop reports, minutes from meetings that should never have been called in the first place." She pointed a bony finger toward the back of the library, where a door labeled "Storage" hung slightly ajar. "There's a map somewhere in there, if you care to look. But I warn you, it's not worth the effort." Undeterred, Alistair pushed open the door, coughing as dust billowed around him. The room was a labyrinth of precariously stacked boxes, each one filled with documents that had been deemed too tedious to preserve in the main collection. Hours passed as he sifted through them, his fingers growing numb from the cold and his mind foggy from the sheer monotony of it all. Just as he was about to give up, his hand brushed against a brittle scroll tucked beneath a pile of livestock inventories. Unrolling it, he found a map, crude and faded, but unmistakably pointing to a location deep in the Blackridge Forest, a place most villagers avoided on account of its reputation for being unbearably dull. According to the map, the vault was hidden beneath an unassuming hill, marked only by a stone engraved with the words, "Rest well, weary scholar." Alistair's heart sank. This was it, the pinnacle of historical drudgery. And yet, he had to see it for himself. Chapter 4. The journey to Blackridge Forest was, in a word, uneventful. The road was straight, the weather was mild, and the scenery was so consistently unremarkable that Alistair found himself nodding off several times, his horse plodding along with the enthusiasm of a clerk counting spoons. The forest, when he finally reached it, was neither dark nor foreboding, just a dense thicket of identical trees, their leaves rustling in a whisper that sounded suspiciously like pages turning. Following the map, he dismounted and trudged through the underbrush, his boots sinking into the soft earth with a sound that was somehow both soggy and monotonous. After what felt like an eternity of walking but was in fact only 47 minutes, he spotted the hill, a gentle, grassy mound that was neither large enough to be impressive nor small enough to be charming. At its base stood the promised stone, its inscription so weathered it was almost illegible. Alistair brushed his fingers over the words, half expecting some grand revelation, but the only thing he felt was a profound sense of exhaustion. The entrance to the vault, according to the map, was hidden behind a patch of particularly uninteresting shrubs. Pushing them aside, he revealed a heavy wooden door, its iron hinges groaning in protest as he pulled it open. The air that rushed out was stale and carried the unmistakable scent of old paper and indifference. Stepping inside, Alistair lit his lantern, the flickering light revealing a cavernous chamber lined with shelves upon shelves of ledgers, each one labeled in meticulous handwriting. Tax revisions, 701 to 702. Census of sheep, Northern Provinces. Minutes of the Committee on Committee Formation. It was, without a doubt, the most boring place he had ever seen. And yet, at the far end of the room, something caught his eye, a single tome, thicker than the others, resting on a pedestal as if it was some kind of sacred text. Drawn by a force he couldn't explain, Alistair approached it, his fingers trembling as he opened the cover. The title page read, simply, "The Complete History of Drying Paint, a Chronological Account." He had found it, the most boring book in the world, and as he began to read, the weight of its contents settled over him like a heavy blanket, his eyelids drooping as the words blurred together. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized he had achieved his goal, he had uncovered a forgotten piece of history. But as sleep claimed him, he couldn't help but wonder if some things were better left forgotten. Chapter 5. When Alistair awoke, he was no longer in the vault. He was lying on the grassy hill outside, the sun high in the sky, though he had no memory of leaving the chamber. The door to the vault was gone, the shrubs undisturbed, as if it had never existed. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by inhaling too much dust in the library? He sat up, groaning as his stiff muscles protested, and that's when he noticed it, a single sheet of parchment tucked into his belt, covered in the same cramped script as the tax record he'd found earlier. But this was no ordinary document. It was a receipt for the Vault of Eternal Repose storage fees, paid in full by the Office of Royal Census, dated just a week prior. The vault was real, and someone was still using it. The implications were staggering. Had generations of bureaucrats been hiding something in plain sight, disguising it as the most boring archive imaginable? Or was the vault itself some kind of elaborate joke, a centuries-long prank played on overzealous historians? Alistair's head throbbed as he tried to make sense of it, but the more he thought, the sleepier he became. The words on the receipt seemed to swim before his eyes, their meaning slipping away like sand through his fingers. Perhaps, he thought as he lay back down, some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Perhaps the true purpose of the vault was simply to exist, a monument to the mundane, a sanctuary for those who sought refuge from the excitement of the world. And as the clouds drifted lazily overhead, Alistair closed his eyes once more, the receipt fluttering from his grasp as he surrendered to the most peaceful sleep he'd ever known. Chapter 6. The village of Eldamere carried on in its usual unhurried manner, oblivious to the historian's strange disappearance and subsequent reappearance on the hill outside Blackridge Forest. When Alistair finally stumbled back into town, his clothes rumpled and his hair streaked with grass stains, the villagers barely glanced up from their tasks. The innkeeper at the weary traveller merely grunted and slid a lukewarm bowl of porridge in his direction, as if nothing were amiss. Alistair, still groggy from his unnatural slumber, tried to recount his discovery to a pair of disinterested merchants nursing pints of ale, but their eyes glazed over before he even reached the part about the tax records. Frustrated but undeterred, he retreated to his room, where he spread out the mysterious receipt on the small wooden desk and examined it under the flickering light of a candle. The document was frustratingly ordinary, no hidden codes, no cryptic symbols, just a bland accounting of storage fees paid in silver coins, stamped with the official seal of the Royal Treasury. Yet the date was impossible. King Aldric the Forgettable had ruled centuries ago, and the Office of Royal Census had been dissolved shortly after his reign. So who, or what, was still maintaining the vault? Determined to find answers, Alistair resolved to visit the capital, where the remnants of the old bureaucracy still lingered in the form of a dusty, underfunded department known as the Bureau of Historical Redundancy. But as he packed his satchel, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The walls of the inn seemed to press in around him, the air thick with the weight of something unsaid. Even the candle flame burned unnaturally still, as if time itself had grown lethargic in this place. With a final glance at the receipt, he blew out the candle and lay down, his mind swimming with half-formed thoughts of endless ledgers and silent, yawning vaults. Sleep took him quickly, as it always did now, dragging him under like a riptide of pure, unrelenting boredom. Chapter 7. The road to the capital was a ribbon of monotony, winding through fields of wheat that stretched to the horizon in unbroken waves of gold. Alistair's horse plodded forward with the enthusiasm of a clerk transcribing meeting minutes, its hooves kicking up little clouds of dust that hung in the air like forgotten punctuation marks. The journey should have taken 3 days, but time seemed to stretch and sag in the historian's presence, as if the universe itself were resisting his quest. By the time the spires of the capital appeared on the horizon, Alistair had dozed off in the saddle twice, each time waking with a start to find his horse had stopped moving altogether, as though it, too, had succumbed to the ennui that clung to him like a second cloak. The city gates loomed ahead, their iron bars pitted with rust and indifference. The guards waved him through without a second glance, their attention fixed on a game of dice that had been going on so long neither could remember who was winning. The Bureau of Historical Redundancy was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the government district, a squat building with peeling paint and a door that groaned like a man who had just realized he'd left the stove on. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ink and resignation. A single clerk sat behind a desk piled high with paperwork, his quill scratching across parchment in a rhythm so steady it could have lulled a warhorse to sleep. Alistair cleared his throat. The clerk looked up, his eyes dull as unpolished buttons. "Yes," he intoned, the word dripping with the weight of 1,000 unanswered memos. Alistair produced the receipt. "I need to know about this." The clerk blinked at it, then at Alistair, then back at the receipt, as if trying to decide which was the greater waste of his time. With a sigh that could have deflated a souffle, he reached beneath his desk and produced a ledger so large it made a noise like a dying tree when he dropped it onto the counter. "Storage fees," he muttered, flipping through pages that crackled with age. "Paid annually. Always on time. No exceptions." Alistair leaned in. "But the Office of Royal Census hasn't existed for centuries. Who's paying these fees?" The clerk's finger paused on a line of text. "The Office of Royal Census," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It's right here, every year, like clockwork." Alistair opened his mouth to argue, but the clerk had already returned to his paperwork, his quill moving in slow, deliberate strokes. The conversation was over. Defeated, Alistair turned to leave, and that's when he saw it. A door at the back of the room, so plain it was nearly invisible, marked only with a small brass plaque that read, "Archival Oversight." Something in his gut told him that behind that door lay the answers he sought. But as he reached for the handle, the clerk spoke without looking up. "I wouldn't." Alistair froze. "Why not?" The clerk's quill paused. "Because," he said, "some things are better left filed." Chapter 8. The door opened with a sigh, revealing a staircase that spiraled down into darkness. Alistair hesitated, the clerk's warning ringing in his ears, but curiosity, or perhaps sheer stubbornness, propelled him forward. The steps were narrow and worn, their edges rounded by generations of shuffling feet. The air grew colder as he descended, the walls slick with a thin film of moisture that glistened in the light of his lantern. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a vast, low-ceilinged chamber, its dimensions impossible to discern in the gloom. Shelves lined every wall, stretching into the darkness like the ribs of some slumbering beast. And on those shelves, row after row of identical boxes, each labeled with a string of numbers that meant nothing to Alistair. This was it, the heart of the Bureau of Historical Redundancy, the place where paperwork came to die. He approached the nearest shelf and pulled down a box at random. Inside were stacks of forms, each one filled out in the same neat, bureaucratic hand. Request for request forms, read one. Application for application review, read another. It was madness. Beautiful, meticulous madness. Alistair was so engrossed in the absurdity of it all that he didn't notice the figure until it was standing right beside him. "You're not supposed to be here," said a voice as dry as parchment. Alistair nearly dropped his lantern. The man, if it was a man, was tall and gaunt, his skin the color of old parchment, his eyes two dark smudges behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. He wore a robe that might have been stylish 2 centuries ago, its sleeves stained with ink. "Who are you?" Alistair managed. The man ignored the question. "This is a restricted archive," he said, plucking the box from Alistair's hands and slotting it back onto the shelf with practiced precision. "Unauthorized access is prohibited, punishable by fine, or worse." Alistair swallowed. "Worse." The man's lips twitched. "Paperwork." Before Alistair could react, the man produced a clipboard from somewhere within his robes and held it out. "Sign here," he said, pointing to a line at the bottom of a form so dense with legalese it made Alistair's head spin. "Acknowledgement of unauthorized archival access and waiver of liability." Alistair took the pen. "What happens if I don't?" The man's smile was thin. Then we escalate to Form 47B. Something in his tone suggested that Form 47B was not to be trifled with. Alistair signed. The man took the clipboard back, satisfied. Good. Now, why are you here? Alistair hesitated, then pulled out the receipt. I need to know about this. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, like a book settling deeper into its binding. Ah, he said. The Vault. Chapter 9. The man, who introduced himself only as the archivist, led Alistair deeper into the chamber, past shelves of forms so dull they seemed to absorb the very light around them. The Vault of Eternal Repose, the archivist intoned, is a special case. Established under King Aldrich to house records of such unparalleled tedium that their mere existence threatened to slow the functioning of the kingdom. Alistair frowned. That's not possible. The archivist gave him a look that suggested he had much to learn about the power of bureaucracy. You've been inside. You've felt it. The weight of those ledges. The pull of that place. Alistair couldn't deny it. Even now, just thinking about the vault made his eyelids heavy. But why keep maintaining it? Why pay storage fees for centuries? The archivist stopped before a door identical to the one upstairs, this one marked with a single word, oversight. Because, he said, some secrets are too dangerous to be remembered. And some are too boring to be forgotten. He pushed the door open. Beyond it lay a room unlike any Alistair had ever seen. The walls were lined not with shelves, but with beds, dozens of them, each occupied by a sleeping figure. Men and women of all ages, their faces peaceful, their chests rising and falling in perfect unison. At the far end of the room, a desk stood beneath a single flickering lamp, and behind it sat a figure so still Alistair at first mistook it for a statue. The archivist approached the desk and bowed. "Keeper," he said, "we have a visitor." The figure stirred, raising a head so lined with wrinkles it resembled a well-thumbed book. The keeper's eyes, when they opened, were the color of faded ink. "Ah," the keeper said, voice like the turning of a page. "The historian." Alistair's mouth went dry. You know me." The keeper smiled. "We know everyone who sleeps." And with that, the truth crashed over Alistair like a wave of molasses. The Vault of Eternal Repose wasn't just a storage facility. It was a lullaby, a weapon, a place where the weight of pure, unadulterated boredom could be harnessed, concentrated, and, if necessary, deployed. The sleepers in this room weren't victims. They were volunteers, guardians of a peace so profound it bordered on oblivion. The keeper leaned forward. "You've felt it, haven't you? The pull, the desire to just let go." Alistair nodded, suddenly aware of how heavy his limbs felt. The keeper's smile widened. "Good, then you understand. The world is loud, historian, chaotic, but here, in the quiet, we maintain the balance." Alistair wanted to ask more, but the words slipped away from him, lost in the fog creeping over his mind. The last thing he saw before his knees buckled was the keeper reaching for a ledger labeled, "New Recruits." Chapter 10. When Alistair awoke, he was back in his room at the Weary Traveller, the receipt crumpled in his fist. Sunlight streamed through the window, painting the floor in lazy stripes. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream, the bureau, the archivist, the room full of sleepers. But then he moved, and something rustled in his pocket. A slip of paper, folded neatly, bearing a single sentence, "Some questions are better left unanswered." And beneath it, a postscript, "P.S. Your storage fees have been paid in full." Alistair stared at the note, his mind strangely empty. The urge to investigate further was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding calm. Whatever secrets the vault held, they were no longer his concern. Somewhere, in a room beneath the earth, a ledger closed with a soft thump. And in the village of Eldamere, life went on, slow and steady as a ticking clock. The innkeeper yawned. A merchant snored over his ledger. And Alistair Thornbrick, historian of little renown, closed his eyes and slept, deeply, dreamlessly, and without a single thought of tax records. Chapter 11. The days that followed Alistair's return to Eldamere passed in a haze of quiet contentment, as though the very air around him had thickened into a pleasant lull. He no longer felt the restless itch to uncover forgotten histories or chase down cryptic leads. Instead, he spent his mornings in the dim light of the inn's common room, sipping lukewarm tea and watching the villagers go about their routines with a detached sort of interest. The receipt from the vault remained tucked in his satchel, but he found he had no desire to look at it again. It was as if his brief encounter with the Bureau of Historical Redundancy had drained him of all curiosity, leaving behind only a serene acceptance of life's mundanity. Even his notes, once filled with feverish scribbles about lost kings and buried artifacts, now consisted of observations so banal they could have been written by a clerk cataloguing turnip yields. The rain fell at a consistent rate for precisely 3 hours and 17 minutes, read one entry. The blacksmith's hammer strikes occurred at intervals of 4.3 seconds, noted another. It was, he supposed, a kind of peace. But peace, like all things, was fleeting. One evening, as Alistair sat in his usual corner of the weary traveller, a stranger entered the inn. This in itself was not unusual. Travellers came and went with predictable frequency, but there was something about this man that set him apart from the usual merchants and wayfarers. He was neither tall nor short, neither young nor old, and his clothing was so unremarkable it seemed to blur at the edges, as if the very fabric resisted being remembered. The only distinctive thing about him was the case he carried, a flat, rectangular box made of some dark wood, its surface polished to a dull sheen. The stranger's eye swept the room before settling on Alistair, and though his expression gave nothing away, the historian felt a prickle of unease, like the first stirrings of a dream too vague to recall upon waking. Without a word, the man crossed the room and sat across from him, placing the box on the table between them with a soft thud. "You've been to the vault," the stranger said, his voice as nondescript as his appearance. It wasn't a question. Alistair's fingers tightened around his tankard. "I don't know what you're talking about." The stranger's lips twitched, though whether in amusement or irritation was impossible to say. He flipped the latch on the box and opened it, revealing a stack of papers so pristine they seemed to glow in the dim light. "These are for you," he said. "Consider them a courtesy." Alistair peered at the top sheet. It was a form, its fields filled with neat, bureaucratic script. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Application for Voluntary Comatose Status, Form 89D." His blood ran cold. "I'm not interested," he said, pushing the box away. The stranger didn't move. "You will be," he said simply. Then he stood, leaving the box on the table, and walked out of the inn without a backward glance. Alistair stared after him, a strange lethargy creeping into his limbs. The box seemed to hum faintly, a sound just at the edge of hearing, like the distant drone of bees. He knew, with a certainty he couldn't explain, that if he opened it again, he would find the form already signed in his name. Chapter 12. The box sat untouched on Alistair's desk for 3 days. He told himself he was resisting out of principle, but the truth was simpler, he was afraid. Not of the box itself, nor of the stranger who had delivered it, but of the part of him that wanted to open it. The part that whispered how easy it would be to fill out the form, to surrender to the sweet, syrupy pull of oblivion. He had felt it before, in the vault, that seductive numbness, the promise of a sleep so deep it bordered on annihilation. And now it was here, in his room, waiting. On the 4th night, he dreamed of the keeper. The old man sat at his desk, just as Alistair remembered, but this time the ledger before him was open to a page with Alistair's name at the top. "You're fighting it," the keeper said, not unkindly. "But why? The world has no need of historians, not really. What difference does it make if one more joins the ranks of the sleeping?" Alistair wanted to argue, to say that his work mattered, that the past was worth preserving, but the words wouldn't come. The keeper smiled, as if he'd heard the unspoken protest anyway. "Think of it as early retirement," he said, and closed the ledger with a sound like a sigh. Alistair woke with a start, his heart pounding. The box was still there, its presence suddenly oppressive. He couldn't stay here, not with it watching him from the desk like some patient predator. He dressed quickly and slipped out of the inn, the night air cool against his skin. The village was quiet, the streets empty save for the occasional cat slinking between shadows. He walked without direction, his feet carrying him toward the edge of town, where the road dissolved into a narrow path that wound its way into the hills. He didn't realize where he was going until he saw it, the stone marker, its inscription barely visible in the moonlight. Rest well, weary scholar. The entrance to the vault. He hadn't meant to come here, and yet here he was, as though drawn by some invisible thread. The shrubs parted easily under his hands, revealing the door, just as he remembered it. This time, there was no hesitation. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Chapter 13. The vault was exactly as Alistair remembered. Endless shelves stretching into the darkness, the air thick with the scent of paper and dust. But this time, he wasn't alone. Figures moved between the shelves, their forms indistinct in the gloom, their footsteps soundless on the stone floor. They paid him no mind as he passed, their attention fixed on the ledgers in their hands, their faces serene in the way of those who have surrendered to something greater than themselves. Alistair moved deeper into the vault, his earlier fear replaced by a strange calm. He knew now why he had come. At the center of the chamber stood the keeper, his desk illuminated by a single lamp. He looked up as Alistair approached, his smile widening. "I knew you'd return," he said. Alistair nodded. "I think I did too." The keeper gestured to the ledger before him. "It's time, then." Alistair hesitated, but only for a moment. "Yes." The keeper's pen hovered over the page. "Any last words?" Alistair thought of the box waiting for him back at the inn, of the form that had already been signed in his name. He thought of the years he'd spent chasing after fragments of the past, of the exhaustion that had dogged him for as long as he could remember. And then he thought of nothing at all. "No," he said, "no last words." The keeper's pen touched the paper, and Alistair felt it, the weight lifting, the world receding, the sweet, slow descent into silence. Somewhere, a door closed softly, and then there was only sleep. Chapter 14. The villagers noticed Alistair's absence, of course, but only in the vague way one notices the lack of a familiar landmark. "Haven't seen that historian fellow in a while," the innkeeper remarked one evening, as he wiped down the bar. The merchant who'd shared Alistair's table shrugged. "Probably moved on. Not much here for his sort." The innkeeper grunted in agreement and moved on to more pressing matters, like the price of ale. Life in Eldamere continued, unchanging and unremarkable, as it always had. The seasons turned, the crops grew and were harvested. The tax collectors came and went, their ledgers filled with numbers that would one day find their way to a vault deep beneath the earth. And in a room lined with beds, a man who had once been a historian slept on, his dreams as quiet and endless as the pages of the books surrounding him. Chapter 15. Years later, a young scholar arrived in Eldamere, her satchel heavy with notes and her eyes bright with the fervor of discovery. She had heard rumors of a vault, a place where the dullest histories were kept, and she was determined to find it. The villagers, when she asked, only shrugged and pointed her toward the library. The librarian, older now but no less weary, listened to her questions with a sigh. "Some things aren't meant to be found," she said. But the scholar persisted, and eventually, as scholars do, she uncovered the truth. The map, the hill, the stone, and finally, the door. She stood before it, her heart pounding, her fingers trembling with anticipation. This was it, the culmination of her research. She took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The air that rushed out was warm and thick, carrying with it the scent of ink and something else, something sweet and heavy, like the promise of a dreamless sleep. The scholar hesitated. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that she should turn back, that some mysteries were better left unsolved. But the lure of knowledge was too strong. She stepped inside. The door swung shut behind her. And then there was only silence. Chapter 16. The scholar's name was Elara Vess, and she had spent her entire life chasing answers to questions no one else cared to ask. The vault should have been the greatest discovery of her career, an untouched archive of forgotten history, waiting to be unearthed. But as she stood in the dim glow of her lantern, the weight of the place settled over her like a leaden blanket. The shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, the sheer volume of records making her head spin. She reached for the nearest ledger, her fingers brushing against its spine, and felt an immediate, overwhelming urge to sit down. To rest, to close her eyes just for a moment. She shook herself. No, she was here for answers. She flipped open the ledger, squinting at the cramped script. Minutes of the annual meeting of the Eldamere Turnip Cultivation Oversight Committee, year 812. Asterisk page after page of discussions on soil acidity, crop rotation schedules, and the contentious debate over whether to increase the size of the turnip measurement standard by half an inch. Elara blinked hard, her vision blurring. This couldn't be it. There had to be something more. She moved deeper into the vault, her footsteps echoing dully against the stone floor. The air grew heavier with each step, the lantern's light seeming to dim as though the darkness itself were thickening around her. Then she saw it, a desk, just like the one in her research notes. And behind it, empty, no keeper, no ledger of names, just a single sheet of paper, placed precisely in the center of the desk. Elara approached, her pulse quickening. The paper was crisp, new, out of place among the ancient records. On it, in neat, unadorned script, were 5 words. "You are not ready yet." Asterisk. A chill ran down her spine. She turned, half expecting to see someone, or something, watching her from the shadows. But there was no one. Only the endless shelves, the endless records, the endless, suffocating quiet. And then, from somewhere deep in the vault, a sound. A soft, rhythmic click, asterisk, like the turning of a page. Chapter 17. Elara's breath came fast and shallow as she followed the sound, her lantern casting shaky pools of light ahead of her. The vault seemed to shift around her, the shelves rearranging themselves when she wasn't looking, the aisles twisting into impossible configurations. The click asterisk came again, louder now, and with it, a whisper of movement. She rounded a corner and stopped dead. A figure sat at a small table, its back to her, hunched over an open ledger. It wore a robe that might once have been gray but had long since faded to the color of dust. Its hand moved steadily across the page, the quill scratching out line after line of text in a looping, hypnotic script. Elara swallowed. Hello. The figure didn't turn. The quill didn't pause. She took a step closer. Who are you? Nothing. Another step. Now she could see the edge of the ledger, could make out the words written there. Elara Vess, scholar, arrived seeking knowledge, unprepared for the weight of it. Asterisk. Her blood turned to ice. The figure's hand stopped. Slowly, so slowly, it turned its head. Elara didn't wait to see its face. She ran. Chapter 18. The vault had no exit. Elara careened through the shelves, her breath ragged, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every turn led her deeper into the maze, every corridor looked the same. The lantern's light flickered, threatening to gutter out. Behind her, the click asterisk of the quill resumed, steady and unhurried. She stumbled into a clearing of sorts, a small space where the shelves gave way to a circle of stone floor. At its center stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal, a book, not a ledger, not a record, a proper book, its cover embossed with gold lettering that gleamed even in the dim light. The truth, asterisk it read. Elara's hands trembled as she reached for it. This was it, the answer, the reason the vault existed. Her fingers brushed the cover, and the world dissolved into white. Chapter 19. When the light faded, Elara was standing in a field. Not a real field, or at least, not one that belonged to the world she knew. The sky was a flat, featureless gray, the grass beneath her feet a shade of green just slightly off asterisk, like a memory of color rather than the thing itself. In the distance, a single tree stood, its branches heavy with what looked like pages, not leaves. Pages. She walked toward it, her footsteps soundless. As she drew closer, she could see words printed on each page, sentences winding around the branches like vines. Some were in languages she recognized. Others were utterly alien, and at the base of the tree, a figure. Not the robed scribe from the vault. Not the keeper. A child. It looked up as she approached, its eyes old in a way that made her stomach twist. "You found me," it said. Elara's voice caught in her throat. "Who are you?" The child smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "I'm the one who writes it all down," it said. "Every tax record, every meeting minute, every forgotten history." It tilted its head. "Even yours." Elara took a step back. "I don't understand." "You will," said the child. And then it reached up, plucked a page from the tree, and held it out to her. Elara didn't want to take it. She took it. The words were her own. Elara Vess, scholar, lost to the vault on the 17th of. The rest was smudged, as if someone had tried to erase it. The child's smile widened. "Almost," it said. Chapter 20. Elara woke in her bed at the inn. Sunlight streamed through the window. Birds chirped outside. The sounds of the village, the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of merchants, drifted up from the street below. It had been a dream. A fevered, impossible dream. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and froze. On her nightstand, a single sheet of paper. Application for voluntary comatose status, Form 89D. Asterisk. Filled out. Signed. Waiting. Elara stared at it for a long time. Then she reached for the pen. Chapter 21. Elara's hand hovered over the form, the pen trembling between her fingers. The signature at the bottom was hers. She knew her own handwriting, but she had no memory of writing it. The ink was dry, the letters crisp, as if they'd been there for days. A chill crept up her spine, not from fear, but from something deeper, something like recognition. This was inevitable. She had always been meant to find the vault, just as the historian before her had, and the one before him, stretching back through time in an unbroken chain of weary scholars who had pressed too far into the quiet places of the world. The room around her seemed to waver, the walls breathing in and out like the sides of some great, slumbering beast. The sounds of the village outside grew muffled, as if someone had stuffed wool in her ears. She looked down at the form again. The words blurred, then sharpened, then blurred once more. Voluntary comatose status. Asterisk. What did that even mean? A sleep from which she might never wake, or something else entirely? Her thoughts moved sluggishly, as though she were already halfway under. The pen touched the paper of its own accord, adding a single, unnecessary flourish to her signature. A drop of ink bloomed like a dark flower beneath the nib. Then, silence. The air in the room grew thick, syrupy. Elara tried to stand, but her limbs refused to obey. The light from the window dimmed, not like the sun was setting, but like the world itself was fading to gray. The last thing she saw before her eyelids grew too heavy to hold open was the form on the table, the words rearranging themselves into a new sentence, "Welcome home." Asterisk. Chapter 22. When Elara opened her eyes, she was lying on a narrow cot in a long, low-ceilinged room lined with identical cots, each occupied by a still, silent figure. The air smelled of dust and old parchment, and the only sound was the faint, rhythmic scratching of a quill from somewhere in the shadows. She sat up slowly, her head swimming. The room was familiar, not just from her dream of the vault, but from something deeper, like a memory from a life she hadn't lived. The other sleepers didn't stir. Their chests rose and fell in perfect unison, their faces smooth and untroubled. At the far end of the room, a figure sat at a desk, its back to her, scribbling in a ledger. Elara knew who it was before it turned. The child from the tree. Its eyes were still too old for its face, its smile still too knowing. "You took longer than most," it said, its voice like the rustle of turning pages. "But you're here now." Elara's tongue felt thick in her mouth. "Where is here?" The child laughed, a sound like a book slamming shut. "Where do you think?" It gestured to the ledger before it. "You're in the story, the one that never ends." Elara looked down at herself. She was wearing a robe the color of faded ink, the fabric soft and weightless against her skin. When she touched the sleeve, her fingers left no impression, as though she were made of smoke. The child watched her, its head tilted. "Don't worry," it said. "You'll get used to it. They all do." It turned back to the ledger, its quill moving once more. "Now sleep. There's work to do when you wake." Elara wanted to protest, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. The room was already darkening at the edges, the child's form blurring into the shadows. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was the whisper of the quill, scratching out a new line in an endless story. Chapter 23. Time passed, or didn't. Elara woke and slept and woke again, though she could never tell the difference between the two. Sometimes she stood at the shelves in the vault, adding new ledgers to the stacks. Sometimes she sat at the desk, filling out forms in a hand that wasn't quite hers. The child, the scribe, she called it now, was always there, watching, correcting, guiding. She learned quickly. The vault was bigger than she'd imagined, bigger than the world, maybe. It held every forgotten record, every overlooked detail, every moment too insignificant to be remembered but too necessary to be lost. And it was growing, always growing. One day, if days existed here, she asked the scribe where the new records came from. It smiled that not quite right smile and pointed upward. "From them," it said. "From the ones who still dream." Elara looked at the ledger open before her. The page was filled with names, each one followed by a date and a single word, processed. Asterisk. She didn't ask what that meant. Somewhere, in the back of her mind, she already knew. The scribe's quill scratched on, relentless. "You'll meet them soon," it said, as though reading her thoughts. "They always come eventually." Elara nodded, her fingers trailing over the names. One of them stood out, the ink still fresh. Alistair Thornbrick. Asterisk. She touched the name, and for the briefest moment, she remembered. A hill, a stone, a door. Then the memory slipped away, like water through her fingers. The scribe was watching her. "It's easier if you don't think about it," it said. Elara nodded again. She picked up her own quill and turned to the next page. There was work to do. Chapter 24. The historian arrived on a day that wasn't a day, his footsteps echoing through the vault like a half-remembered dream. Elara watched from the shelves as he stumbled into the central chamber, his eyes wide with confusion and the dregs of fading curiosity. She knew him, though she couldn't say how. His name hovered just out of reach, a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. The scribe was already at the desk, its ledger open, its quill poised. "Welcome," it said, its voice sweet as spoiled honey. The historian, Alistair, his name was Alistair, looked from the scribe to the rows of sleeping figures, then to Elara. His breath caught. "You," he whispered. Elara tilted her head. "Do I know you?" Something like pain flashed across his face, but it was gone before she could be sure. "No," he said at last. "No, I suppose not." The scribe smiled. "Sign here," it said, pushing the ledger toward him. Alistair hesitated. His eyes met Elara's again, searching for something, recognition, maybe, or defiance. But there was nothing to find. Elara had been in the vault a long time. Longer than she could remember. Longer than he could imagine. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world, Alistair took the quill and signed his name. The scribe's smile widened. "Good," it said. "Now sleep." And just like that, it was over. Alistair's shoulders slumped, his eyes fluttered shut, and he crumpled to the floor like a marionette with its strings cut. Elara stepped forward to catch him, her movements automatic. His weight was nothing, less than nothing. She carried him to an empty cot and laid him down, smoothing his brow with fingers that left no mark. The scribe was already writing in the ledger. Alistair Thornbrick. Processed. Elara watched the words dry, then turned back to the shelves. There was work to do. Chapter 25. The vault was quiet. The vault was always quiet. Elara moved through the aisles, her fingers trailing over the spines of ledgers that hadn't existed yesterday, or the day before, or the day before that. The scribe was at its desk, as always, its quill scratching out names in an endless, unbroken line. Somewhere in the rows of cots, Alistair slept, his face peaceful, his dreams empty. Elara paused, looking down at him. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she remembered, a hill, a stone, a door. A choice. Then the moment passed, and the memory slipped away, like sand through an hourglass. The scribe's voice floated to her from the shadows. Elara, not a question, a command. She turned away from Alistair and went to the desk. The scribe held out a quill. Your turn, it said. Elara took the quill without hesitation. The ledger was open to a fresh page. At the top, a name she didn't recognize. Below it, space for her to write, to record, to process. She dipped the quill in ink and began to write. The words came easily, as though they'd always been there, waiting. The scribe watched her, its two old eyes gleaming with something like pride. Good, it whispered. Very good. Elara didn't reply. There was no need. The vault stretched on around them, endless and eternal, a monument to all the things the world had chosen to forget. And in the quiet, in the dark, the work went on. Chapter 26. The scratching of Elara's quill became as constant as the slow breath of the sleepers around her, the ink flowing in an unbroken stream of names and dates and final notations that marked the end of each story before it was filed away into the vault's insatiable depths. The scribe no longer needed to guide her hand, she knew the work by instinct now, the rhythm of it etched into her bones. Names appeared in the ledger before her as if summoned by the vault itself, materializing in faint, ghostly script before solidifying under her pen. Marcus the cartographer. Processed. Sister Elaine of the White Veil. Processed. Asterisk one after another, the names came, and one after another, she recorded them, her movements precise, mechanical. The scribe had stopped speaking to her entirely, its presence reduced to a shadow at the edge of her vision, a silent observer to her ceaseless labor. She no longer wondered about the world outside the vault, no longer questioned where the names came from or what processed truly meant. The work was all that mattered. The work was all there was. Then, one day, if days could be said to exist in a place without time, a name appeared that made her hand still. Elara Vess. Asterisk her own. The ink was fresh, glistening, as though the ledger had only just written it itself. She stared at it, the letters swimming before her eyes. A distant part of her, a part she had thought long buried, stirred. She remembered sunlight, the weight of a satchel on her shoulder, the smell of old books and dust. The scribe's voice, when it came, was softer than she had ever heard it. It happens sometimes, it said. The vault takes everything, even the memory of those who serve it. Elara's fingers trembled. How long? The scribe didn't answer. It didn't need to. She already knew. Too long. Long enough that the world outside had forgotten her. Long enough that her own name was just another entry in the ledger, waiting to be processed. The quill was heavy in her hand. The scribe watched her, its expression unreadable. You don't have to, it said. But you will. And it was right. She always did. The tip of the quill touched the page. Elara Vess. Processed. Asterisk the moment the ink dried, she forgot she had ever written it. Chapter 27. The vault was larger now. Or perhaps it had always been this large, and Elara had simply failed to notice. The shelves stretched into impossible distances, the aisles between them twisting and folding in on themselves like the labyrinth of some half-remembered myth. The sleepers, too, had multiplied, their cots filling every available space until they lined not just the central chamber but the corridors beyond, their silent forms a testament to the vault's endless hunger. Elara moved among them like a ghost, her robe whispering against the stone floor, her fingers trailing over the edges of ledgers as she passed. The scribe was rarely at the desk now. It had other duties, it said, though it never specified what they were. The ledger was hers alone to tend, the names hers alone to record. She didn't mind. The work was all she knew. The work was all she wanted to know. Then, one day, a new sound. Not the scratch of a quill or the sigh of a sleeper, but something else. Something alive. Footsteps, hesitant, stumbling, but unmistakable. Elara turned, the motion slow, deliberate. A figure stood at the edge of the central chamber, its form wavering like a mirage. A woman, young, her eyes wide with confusion and the dregs of a curiosity not yet extinguished. A scholar. Elara knew her at once, though she couldn't say how. The woman's gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time in centuries, or was it millennia, Elara felt something stir in her chest. Recognition, not of the woman, but of herself. She had been like this once. Afraid, lost, determined. The scribe's voice, when it came, was a whisper in her ear. Process her. The ledger was already open on the desk, the woman's name glowing faintly at the top of a fresh page. Elara looked at it, then at the woman, then at the quill in her hand. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. She stepped toward the desk. The woman, the scholar, took a step back. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Elara didn't answer. She didn't know anymore. The quill touched the page. The scholar's name filled itself in, the ink spreading like a stain. Processed. Asterisk. The scholar's knees buckled. Elara caught her before she could hit the floor, her arms moving of their own accord. The scholar's breath was warm against her neck, her heartbeat a frantic flutter against Elara's palm. For a moment, just a moment, Elara hesitated. Then the moment passed, and she carried the scholar to an empty cot, laying her down with the same care she had shown all the others. The scribe watched from the shadows, its two old eyes gleaming with something like approval. Elara returned to the desk. The ledger was already open to the next page. The next name. The work was all that mattered. The work was all there was. Chapter 28. The names came faster now, the ledger filling with a speed that should have been impossible. Elara wrote without pause, her hand moving in a ceaseless, mechanical rhythm, the words spilling from her quill like water from a broken dam. Processed, processed, processed. Asterisk. The vault hummed around her, a soundless vibration that resonated in her bones, a pulse as steady and unrelenting as her own heartbeat. The scribe was gone more often than not, its presence reduced to a fleeting shadow, a whisper of movement at the edge of her vision. She didn't question its absence. She didn't question anything anymore. The work was all she knew. Then, one day, a change. A name appeared in the ledger that was not a name at all, but a question. Why? Asterisk. The ink was dark, the letters jagged, as though written in haste. Elara stared at it, her quill poised above the page. She had never seen a question in the ledger before. Never seen anything but names. A sound behind her made her turn. The scribe stood there, its expression unreadable. A mistake, it said, reaching for the ledger. But before it could close the book, another word appeared. Remember. Asterisk. The scribe's hand stilled. Its two old eyes flicked to Elara's face, searching for something. Fear, perhaps, or understanding. But there was nothing to find. Elara looked down at the page. Remember what? Asterisk. She thought, and as if in answer, the ledger replied. You. Asterisk. Chapter 29. The vault shuddered. The shelves trembled, their contents shifting, rearranging, as though the very fabric of the place were unraveling. The scribe's face twisted into something like panic. No, it hissed, snatching the ledger from the desk. This isn't allowed. But the words kept coming, spilling across the page in a flood of ink, each one a hammer blow against the silence that had reigned for so long. Elara, scholar, sleeper, liar. Elara stepped back, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in centuries. The scribe slammed the ledger shut, but the words seeped through the cover, staining its hands black. "You were perfect," it whispered, its voice breaking. "You were supposed to forget." The vault groaned around them, the sound like the waking of some great beast. The sleepers stirred in their cots, their breaths coming faster, their fingers twitching as if caught in the throes of a dream. Elara looked at him, then at the scribe, then at her own hands, hands that had written 1,000 names, 1,000 endings. Whose hands are these? Asterisk. The question came unbidden, a spark in the dark. The scribe lunged for her, its fingers closing around her wrist like a vice. "You belong here," it snarled. "You belong to me." But the vault was changing. The walls were bleeding ink, the floor buckling under the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. And Elara remembered. Chapter 30. The world dissolved into white. When the light faded, Elara was standing in a field. Not the false field from before, but a real one, the grass green and alive beneath her feet, the sky a brilliant, untarnished blue. The air smelled of rain and earth and things growing. Behind her, the vault was gone. In its place stood a tree, a real tree, its branches heavy with leaves, not pages. And at its base, a figure. Not the scribe, not a child, a man, Alistair. He looked up as she approached, his eyes clear, his smile warm. "Took you long enough," he said. Elara's breath caught. She reached for him, her fingers brushing his sleeve, and this time, they left a mark. The wind stirred the grass around them, carrying with it the faint, distant sound of a quill scratching against paper. But it was fading, growing quieter, until at last, there was only silence. And in that silence, Elara took Alistair's hand, and together, they walked away from the tree, away from the past, away from the vault and all its endless, hungry dark. The sun was rising, the world was waiting, and for the first time in 1,000 years, Elara Vess was awake. Chapter 31. The sunlight was a revelation, a shock of gold that seared through Elara's vision like a brand, the warmth of it pressing against her skin with an intensity that made her gasp. How long had it been since she'd felt real heat, real light? Alistair's hand was solid in hers, his fingers calloused and alive, and the grass beneath their feet whispered secrets as they walked, the blades bending underfoot only to rise again behind them, unbroken. The tree shrank in the distance, its silhouette blurring into the horizon, and with every step, the weight that had anchored Elara to the vault lessened, the memories of ink and silence peeling away like old parchment. She could hear birds, real birds, their songs stitching the air into something bright and chaotic, and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers, of soil, of things that grew and died and grew again. Alistair squeezed her hand, his voice rough with disuse but buoyant. "They'll come after us," he said, not with fear but with certainty, as though this was simply another fact of the world. "The sky is blue, the grass is green, the vault will not let go so easily." Elara nodded, her pulse steady, her breath even. Let them come. She had spent centuries, millennia, filing away the forgotten, but she was no longer the vault's scribe. She was Elara Vess, scholar, and she would not be erased again. Chapter 32. The village appeared at the edge of the field like a mirage, its thatched roofs hunched against the wind, its streets winding and narrow. It was familiar, though Elara couldn't say why. Had she been here before? Or was it simply that all villages looked the same after a while, their rhythms as predictable as the turning of pages? The people, though, they were different. They moved with a vitality that made her chest ache, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of barter and gossip and laughter. No one glanced at her or Alistair as they passed, the gazes sliding over the pair as though they were ghosts, half seen and quickly dismissed. Alistair led her to the inn, its sign creaking in the breeze, the weary traveler, the paint faded but the names still legible. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of ale and sweat and burning tallow, and the murmur of conversation started for a heartbeat as they entered before resuming, louder now, as though to compensate for the pause. The innkeeper, a broad-shouldered woman with a scar cutting through her eyebrow, eyed them with a mixture of wariness and disinterest. Rooms are 2 coppers a night, she said, wiping her hands on her apron. Meals extra. Alistair slid the coins across the counter, his movements deliberate. We'll take 1. The innkeeper's gaze flicked between them, but she said nothing, only pocketed the coins and jerked her chin toward the stairs. Second door on the left. Don't cause trouble. The room was small, the bed narrow, the window a square of grimy glass overlooking the village square. Elara sat on the edge of the mattress, the straw crunching beneath her weight, and stared at her hands, clean now, the ink stains gone as though they'd never been. Alistair bolted the door behind them, his expression grim. They'll know where we are soon, he said. The vault doesn't like losing its scribes. Elara looked up, meeting his eyes. What do we do? Alistair's smile was sharp, edged with something like defiance. We remember, he said. And we run. Chapter 33. The dream came as it always did. The shelves, the ledger, the child with its 2 old eyes watching as she wrote name after name after name. But this time, Elara knew it was a dream, and this time, she looked up from the page and met the scribe's gaze. No, she said, her voice steady. The vault shuddered, the shelves rippling like water, the sleepers stirring in their cots. The scribe's smile faltered. You belong here, it whispered, but the words lacked their old power, crumbling like dry paper in the air between them. Elara closed the ledger, the sound like the slamming of a tomb. I don't. And then she was awake, the dream dissolving into the grey light of dawn, Alistair's hand on her shoulder, his breath warm against her cheek. They're coming, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Outside, the village was still asleep, the streets empty, the sky streaked with pink. But beneath the silence, there was something else, a hush, a held breath, a sense of waiting. Elara dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the laces of her borrowed boots, her heart pounding in her throat. Alistair cracked the door open, his body tense, his eyes scanning the hallway. We go out the back, he said. Stay close. The inn was silent as they crept down the stairs, the floorboards groaning under their weight, the air thick with the scent of last night's ale. The kitchen door led to a narrow alley, the ground slick with dew, the walls pressing in on either side. They ran, their footsteps muffled, their breaths coming fast and shallow. Behind them, a sound, a whisper, a sigh, the rustle of pages turning. Elara didn't look back. She knew what she would see. The vault was coming for its scribes. Chapter 34. The forest swallowed them whole, the trees closing ranks behind them like sentinels, their branches weaving a canopy so thick the sunlight fractured into shards of gold. Elara's lungs burned, her legs trembling with the effort of the climb, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop, not when the air itself seemed to thicken with the vault's presence, not when every shadow seemed to twist into the shape of a reaching hand. Alistair was ahead of her, his form a blur between the trunks, his voice urging her forward. Just a little farther, he panted, his words punctuated by the snap of twigs underfoot. There's a place, a safe place. She didn't ask how he knew. It didn't matter. The ground sloped upward, the trees thinning, and then, suddenly, impossibly, they were standing on a cliff's edge, the world spread out before them in a panorama of green and blue and gold. The village was a smudge in the distance, the road a pale ribbon winding through the hills. And there, nestled in the rock face, was a cave, its mouth dark, its edges worn smooth by time. Alistair pulled her inside, his hands steady on her shoulders. We'll be safe here, he said, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. The cave was small, the air cool and damp, the walls slick with condensation. Elara sank to the ground, her back against the stone, her breath finally slowing. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, familiar scent of ink. Alistair sat beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers. They won't stop, he said quietly. Elara closed her eyes. I know. Chapter 35. The cave was not a cave. Elara realized it the moment she woke, the stone beneath her fingers too smooth, too even, the air too still. The walls were shelves, the floor was a desk, and the entrance, where the entrance had been, was now a door, heavy and oak and unmistakable. The vault had found them. Alistair was already on his feet, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. No, he breathed, the word a prayer, a curse. The door creaked open, revealing not the cliffside, not the forest, but the vault's central chamber, the sleepers in their cots, the ledger on the desk, the scribe waiting with its two old eyes. "Welcome home," it said, its voice sweet as poisoned honey. Elara stood, her legs steady, her chin lifted. She was tired of running. The scribe held out a quill, its tip glistening with fresh ink. "You know what to do," it murmured. Elara took the quill. She looked at the ledger, at the names waiting to be written, at the endless cycle of forgetting and remembering and forgetting again. And then she turned the page. Not to record a name, not to process another soul, but to write something new, something true. "The vault is a lie," asterisk she wrote, the ink spreading like a wound. "The sleepers can wake," asterisk the scribe shrieked, a sound like tearing paper, its hands scrabbling at the page. But it was too late. The words were written, the words were true, and all around them, the sleepers began to stir. Chapter 36. The vault convulsed as the sleepers woke, their eyes fluttering open like the pages of 1,000 books snapping shut at once, the gasps filling the air with a sound like wind through dry leaves. The scribe recoiled, its too old face twisting in horror as the ledger beneath Elara's hands began to smolder, the ink of her words boiling across the parchment like a living thing. "You can't," it hissed, but its voice was drowned out by the creak of cots, the rustle of robes, the growing murmur of voices that hadn't spoken in centuries. Alistair was at her side in an instant, his fingers closing around her wrist, not to pull her away but to anchor her as the ground beneath them trembled. The shelves swayed, their contents spilling onto the floor in a cascade of scrolls and loose papers, the names on them glowing faintly before dissolving into ash. The scribe lunged for the ledger, its fingers blackening as it touched the burning pages, its screams merging with the groaning of the vault's collapsing structure. Elara didn't move. She watched as the sleepers stood, their movements stiff but deliberate, the gazes clearing as they took in the chaos around them. One by one, they turned to her, their expressions shifting from confusion to recognition to something like gratitude. The scribe was on its knees now, its form unraveling like a poorly bound book, its two old eyes fixed on Elara with a hatred so pure it was almost awe-inspiring. "You'll regret this," it spat, its voice fraying at the edges. "You don't know what you've done." Elara met its gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said, "I do." And with a final, shuddering groan, the vault collapsed inward, the darkness receding like a tide, leaving behind only the cliffside, the forest, the open sky, and the sleepers, blinking in the sunlight like newborns. Chapter 37. The world was louder than Elara remembered. The wind in the trees, the chatter of the awakened, the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was almost overwhelming after the vault's endless silence. The sleepers, no, not sleepers anymore, just people, men and women with names and histories and futures, clustered together on the cliffside, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions and exclamations. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stood in silence, their faces turned to the sun as though they'd never seen it before. Alistair was beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers, his breath coming in slow, steady waves. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the din. Elara looked at the crowd, at the faces slowly turning toward her, their expressions a mix of hope and uncertainty. She had no answer for him. She hadn't thought beyond this moment, beyond the act of breaking the vault's hold. But the people were waiting, and the scribe's final words echoed in her mind like a warning. "You don't know what you've done." Asterisk she took a deep breath. "Now," she said, "we find out what the world looks like without the vault." And as if in answer, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of grass and earth and something new, something unnameable. The first of the awakened, a woman with silver-streaked hair and hands that still trembled, stepped forward, her chin lifted. "Lead the way," she said. And Elara, with Alistair at her side and the others at her back, did. Chapter 38. The village was in chaos when they returned. The innkeeper's mouth fell open at the sight of the crowd filing through the streets, her hands clutching her apron like a lifeline. The merchants abandoned their stalls, the children stopped the games, and even the stray dogs paused in their scavenging to watch the procession pass. Elara kept her head high, her strides even, though every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to find a quiet corner where she could catch her breath and make sense of what had happened. But there was no time for that. The awakened moved through the village like a tide, their presence impossible to ignore, their voices rising in a chorus of confusion and wonder. Where are we? What year is it? Is this real? The questions came faster than Elara could answer, but she tried anyway, her voice steady even as her hands shook. The villagers, to their credit, didn't flee. They listened. They brought food and water and blankets. They whispered among themselves, their eyes wide with awe and fear. And then, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the first of the villagers stepped forward, a young man with a farmer's calloused hands and a scholar's keen eyes. "My grandfather told stories about you," he said to one of the awakened, his voice trembling. "He said you vanished one day, that the vault took you." The awakened, a man with a soldier's bearing and a poet's weary smile, nodded. "It did," he said. "But we're back now." And just like that, the dam broke. The villagers surged forward, their fear giving way to curiosity, then to joy, as they recognized names and faces from old tales, from half-remembered histories. Elara watched it all from the edge of the square, her body numb, her mind reeling. Alistair's hand found hers, his grip firm. "You did this," he said, his voice thick with something like pride. Elara shook her head. "We did," and for the first time since waking on the cliffside, she allowed herself to believe it might be true. Chapter 39. The days that followed were a blur of voices and faces, of stories shared and memories reclaimed. The awakened, now simply people, individuals with pasts and futures, integrated into the village with a speed that bordered on miraculous. The farmer's grandson offered his barn as a temporary shelter. The innkeeper opened her doors to those who needed rest. Even the village mayor, a pragmatic woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, set aside her skepticism and organized a council to help the newcomers find their footing. Elara and Alistair stayed on the periphery, watching it all unfold with a mix of relief and exhaustion. They'd done what they set out to do. The vault was gone. The sleepers were free. But the scribe's warning still lingered in the back of Elara's mind, a shadow she couldn't shake. "You don't know what you've done." Asterisk she didn't. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Alistair seemed to sense her unease. "It's over," he said one evening as they sat on the inn's porch, the stars wheeling overhead. Elara shook her head. "Is it?" She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Alistair's silence was answer enough. The vault was gone, but the world was vast, and secrets had a way of lingering. Still, for now, there was peace. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 40. The dream came again, as she'd known it would. The shelves stretched endlessly in every direction, the air thick with the scent of ink and dust. The desk was there, the ledger open upon it, the pages blank. And the scribe, or what remained of it, stood watching her, its form frayed at the edges, its two old eyes dim but still burning with malice. "You think you've won," it whispered, its voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "But the vault is older than you know. It cannot be destroyed, only relocated." Elara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The scribe's smile was a gash in its ravaged face. "Sleep well, Elara Vess," it murmured. "We'll be waiting." And then she was awake, the first light of dawn spilling through the window, Alistair's steady breathing beside her. Outside, the village stirred to life, the sounds of laughter and conversation drifting on the breeze. Elara lay still for a long moment, her heart pounding, the scribe's words echoing in her skull. Then she rose, dressed, and stepped out into the sunlight. The world was bright. The world was loud. The world was alive. And whatever came next, she would face it as she had faced the vault, not as a scribe, not as a sleeper, but as Elara Vess, who remembered. And that, for now, was enough. Chapter 41. The village thrived in the weeks that followed, its streets bustling with new energy as the awakened settled into their reclaimed lives. The blacksmith's forge burned hotter than ever under the hands of a man who had last worked metal 3 centuries prior. The herbwoman's garden flourished under the care of a woman who whispered to the plants in a language no one recognized. Even the children played new games, taught to them by elders who had been children themselves when the vault took them. Elara moved among them like a ghost, her presence a quiet reminder of the debt they could never repay. She should have felt joy. Instead, she felt only the weight of the scribe's warning, the certainty that this peace was fragile, temporary. Alistair noticed, of course. He always did. "You're waiting for the other shoe to drop," he said one evening as they walked the outskirts of the village, the setting sun painting the fields in shades of gold and crimson. Elara didn't deny it. "Aren't you?" Alistair's smile was grim. "Every damn day." They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the crunch of dry grass beneath their boots and the distant bleating of sheep. Then, just as the first stars began to appear, Alistair stopped dead, his hand closing around Elara's wrist like a vice. "Do you hear that?" She did, a sound like rustling paper, like the turning of 1,000 pages at once. It came from the old well at the edge of the field, its stones worn smooth by generations of use. The water within had run dry decades ago, the villagers said. But now, as Elara and Alistair approached, they could see something glinting in the depths, not water, but ink, black and endless, rising slowly toward the rim. Chapter 42. The ink spilled over the edge of the well in a slow, viscous wave, spreading across the ground like a stain, like a shadow given form. It didn't soak into the earth. It clung to the surface, shifting, coalescing, until it resolved itself into shapes, letters, words, sentences crawling across the dirt like insects. "You cannot unmake us," they read. "We are the memory of the world." Alistair took a step back, his face pale. "It's the vault," he whispered. "Or what's left of it." Elara didn't move. She watched as the words multiplied, as they began to form familiar names, names from the ledger, names of the awakened. And then, beneath them, a new sentence, "We will take them back." The ink surged forward, tendrils lashing out like whips, and Elara knew with sudden, terrible clarity what it wanted. The vault would reclaim its sleepers. It would start with the village. And then it would spread. She turned to Alistair, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Run. Warn the others." He hesitated only a moment before nodding and sprinting toward the village, his shouts already ringing through the twilight. Elara faced the well, the ink, the remnants of the thing she had thought destroyed. The scribe had been right. The vault couldn't be killed. But maybe, just maybe, it could be contained. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the only weapon she had, a quill, its tip still stained with the ink she had used to defy the vault. She knelt, the ink creeping toward her boots, and began to write. Chapter 43. The words came easily, as though they had been waiting inside her all along. "The vault is broken," she wrote, the letters searing into the ground like brands. "The sleepers are free." The ink recoiled, hissing like a scalded cat, the words she had written glowing with a light that was not of this world. But it wasn't enough. The vault was too vast, too ancient. It would regroup. It would return. Unless, Elara's hand stilled. There was one option. One terrible, final option. She took a deep breath and wrote the only thing that might work: "I will take their place." The ink went still. The night held its breath. And then, all at once, the words rushed toward her, engulfing her hands, her arms, her chest, pouring into her mouth and nose and eyes until she was filled with them, until she was nothing but words, nothing but ink, nothing but memory. The last thing she saw was Alistair's face, his mouth open in a scream she could no longer hear. The last thing she felt was the vault closing around her like a fist. And then there was only silence. Chapter 44. Alistair woke to sunlight and birdsong and the smell of fresh bread. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, the vault, the ink, Elara. Then he sat up and saw the well, its stones clean and dry, its depths empty. And he knew, the village was alive around him, the awakened going about the days as though nothing had happened. Because nothing had. The vault was gone, the threat was over, and Elara was nowhere to be found. He searched for her, of course. He asked every villager, every traveler, every child playing in the streets. No one remembered her, no one but him. That was the price she had paid. To save them, she had let the world forget her. Alistair stood at the edge of the field, the wind tugging at his clothes, the sun warm on his face. Somewhere, in the quiet between breaths, he thought he heard the scratch of a quill. Somewhere, in the corner of his vision, he thought he saw a shadow move. He smiled, small and sad. "I remember," he whispered. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 45. The dream was different this time. There were no shelves, no ledger, no scribe. Only a desk, and at it, a figure robed in ink, its face hidden, its hand moving steadily across an endless page. It didn't look up as Elara approached, but she knew it sensed her presence. "Is this my punishment?" she asked, her voice echoing in the emptiness. The figure shook its head. "No," it said, and the voice was hers, and not hers. "This is your gift." It turned the page, revealing words Elara had written long ago, in another life. "The vault is broken. The sleepers are free." Asterisk, and beneath them, a new line, fresh and glistening, "But stories must still be told." Asterisk. The figure lifted its head, and Elara saw her own face beneath the hood, her own eyes staring back at her, older and wiser and infinitely sad. "Welcome home," the figure said. And Elara, at last, understood. She sat at the desk. She picked up the quill. And she began to write. Chapter 46. The quill moved with a will of its own now, its ink flowing across the page in a ceaseless river of words that spilled into the emptiness around her, forming walls, shelves, the faint outlines of a vault that was not quite the same as the one she had destroyed. This one was smaller, softer, its edges blurred like a half-remembered dream. Elara's hands ached with the effort of creation, her vision swimming as the new structure took shape around her, its shelves filling with books that wrote themselves, their pages whispering secrets she could almost understand. The figure, her other self, her shadow, the part of her that had always belonged to the vault, watched from the edges of the growing space, its hooded head tilting as the walls solidified. "You see now," it murmured, its voice the rustle of pages turning. The vault was never the enemy. It was a necessity, a place for the stories too heavy for the world to carry. Elara wanted to argue, to scream that no story was worth the cost the vault had demanded, but the words wouldn't come. They were already on the page before her, flowing from the quill in a script that was hers and yet not hers. "The world forgets," asterisk, the ink wrote. "But here, we remember." Asterisk, the figure nodded, satisfied, and as it stepped back into the shadows, Elara realized with a jolt that she could no longer tell where it ended and she began. The boundary between them had blurred, their edges merging like ink in water, and the knowledge should have terrified her, but instead, it settled over her like a second skin, familiar and inevitable. The vault hummed around her, a living thing now, its pulse syncing with her own. She was its scribe. It was her home. And outside, in the world she had left behind, Alistair would keep walking through sunlit fields, would keep remembering her, would keep the door open, just a crack, in case she ever found her way back. Chapter 47. The dreams came less often now, their edges softening with time, their colors fading like old parchment left too long in the sun. Alistair still woke sometimes in the dead of night, his hand outstretched as though to catch a figure that was no longer there, his mouth shaping a name that echoed in the silence. But the days were easier. The village thrived, the awakened weaving themselves into its fabric with a grace that spoke of centuries spent waiting for this second chance. The children, those born of the village and those who had slept in the vault for longer than history could measure, played together in the square, their laughter a balm against the quiet grief that lingered in the corners of Alistair's heart. He took to walking in the evenings, his feet carrying him to the edge of the field where the old well stood, its stones silent and dry. There were no more whispers of ink, no more creeping shadows, just the wind in the grass and the distant call of nightbirds. He liked to think she could hear them too, wherever she was. Liked to think she remembered. On one such evening, as the first stars pricked the sky, he found a scrap of parchment wedged between the well's stones, its edges frayed but its surface pristine. A single word was written there, in a hand he would know anywhere, always. Alistair tucked the note into his pocket, his fingers brushing the familiar curve of the letters, and smiled. Some bonds, it seemed, even the vault could not break. Chapter 48. The new vault was different. Smaller, yes, but also kinder, its shelves lined with books that hummed softly when touched, their spines warm under Elara's fingers. She tended them as she had once tended the old vault's ledgers, but this time, the names she wrote were not prisoners, they were gifts. Stories too painful for the world to hold, memories too bright to fade, secrets too precious to lose. The figure, her shadow, herself, worked beside her, its quill moving in tandem with hers, their voices blending in the quiet. Will they ever wake? Elara asked one day, her hand hovering over a book bound in blue cloth, its pages pulsing like a heartbeat. The figure shook its head. Not unless the world is ready to bear them. Elara nodded. She understood now. The vault was not a prison. It was a sanctuary, a place where the fragile things could rest until they were needed. Outside, beyond the veil of ink and memory, the world turned, its stories unfolding in sunlight and shadow. And here, in the quiet, Elara kept watch. She was the scribe, the keeper, the rememberer, and though she might never walk in the sun again, though Alistair's face might fade with the centuries, she would hold this space for as long as it was needed. The quill moved, the pages turned, and the stories, at last, were safe. Chapter 49. The years stretched thin as parchment, and the village grew into a town, then a city, its cobbled streets swallowing the fields where Alistair had once walked with Elara's name unspoken between them. He aged as all men do, his hair silvering, his hands growing rough with time, but his footsteps never faltered on the path to the old well, now a relic encircled by iron railings, its stones worn smooth by generations of fingers tracing the grooves where ink had once risen like a living thing. The note he'd found that long ago evening remained tucked in the breast pocket of his coat, its edges frayed but the words still clear, always. The city's children whispered tales of the well's guardian, a stooped figure who came at dusk to murmur secrets into its depths, though none dared approach him. They didn't see how his lips shaped the same name with every visit. Didn't see how the wind sometimes answered in a voice like rustling pages. On the night his breath grew ragged and his legs refused to carry him farther, Alistair pressed his forehead to the well's cold rim and exhaled a lifetime of words unspoken. The stone beneath his skin warmed. A droplet of ink, impossible, after all these years, welled from a crack and traced a single rune onto his wrist. He smiled as the darkness took him, the note fluttering from his grasp into the void below. Chapter 50. The vault received him gently. Not the cavernous nightmare of his memories, but a smaller place, intimate as a study, its shelves lined with books whose titles pulsed like heartbeat. A figure waited at the central desk, its hood thrown back to reveal a face both familiar and strange, Elara, but not the Elara he'd known. This one's eyes held centuries. Her fingers were stained not with ink but with light. You took your time, she said, her voice the whisper of a page turning. Alistair laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet. I had things to finish. She rose, her robe swirling like liquid shadow, and took his hands. The rune on his wrist flared, its lines spreading up his arm in filaments of gold. And now, he looked around at the vault they would tend together, at the stories waiting to be kept or released, at the endless, quiet work of remembrance. Now, he said, we begin. Chapter 51. The world outside spun on, heedless of the guardians in its seams. Wars were fought and forgotten. Kings rose and fell. The city around the well crumbled to dust, then rose again in glass and steel. But in the space between breaths, in the hush before waking, sometimes a listener might catch the murmur of two voices weaving through the dark. A man's laugh, warm as old whiskey. A woman's reply, crisp as parchment. And if the tale they were telling sounded like your own, if the cadence of your joys and sorrows echoed in their words, well, that was only to be expected. Every story must have its keepers. Chapter 52. The ink-stained guardians worked in perfect synchrony through the turning of ages, their hands moving in unison across the pages of the world's unwritten chronicles. The vault had become something far beyond its original purpose, no longer a prison for forgotten histories but a living tapestry where every joy, every sorrow, every quiet moment of human existence found its reflection in the shimmering lines of their ceaseless writing. Elara's quill danced across a page describing a child's first steps in some distant century while Alistair's pen captured the last words whispered between lovers separated by war. The books around them pulsed with contained life, their spines expanding and contracting like lungs as new stories were added to the collection. Occasionally, when a particular narrative grew too heavy for the vault to contain, the two scribes would exchange a glance, nod in silent agreement, and release it back into the world, a long-forgotten melody surfacing in a composer's dream, a lost technique revealing itself to a struggling artisan, a buried truth emerging in some scholar's research. The work was endless but never tiresome, for each story they preserved created ripples in the fabric of reality itself. Chapter 53. The system operated flawlessly until the day the anomaly appeared. Alistair noticed it first, a single line of text in an otherwise pristine manuscript that read, "This is not how it happened." The words glowed faintly crimson against the black ink, pulsing with unsettling energy. As he reached to touch the page, the letters rearranged themselves into a new sentence, "You weren't there." Elara looked up from her work, sensing the disturbance in the vault's equilibrium. The books around them began to tremble on their shelves as conflicting narratives battled for dominance within their pages. A first edition account of the fall of Constantinople now contained three contradictory versions of the emperor's final moments. A chronicle of the Apollo missions showed Armstrong planting both left and right feet on lunar soil simultaneously. The very air crackled with paradox as the vault's careful order unraveled. "Something's trying to rewrite history," Elara whispered, her fingers tightening around the raven feather quill that had once belonged to the original scribe. Alistair watched in horror as the distortion spread, entire shelves dissolving into swirling clouds of fragmented text. Then came the voice, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, whispering from everywhere and nowhere at once, "You've been careless with my story." Chapter 54. The temperature in the vault plummeted as the entity manifested, not as a figure but as an absence, a human-shaped void where no ink could adhere, no words could take form. It moved through the shelves with terrifying purpose, its passage erasing entire volumes as it went. "We remember everything," Elara protested, placing herself between the creature and their life's work. The void paused, and for the first time, words appeared in its chest, not written but carved, as if some invisible hand had scored them directly into reality. "Remembering is not the same as knowing." Alistair understood first. "It's not a story we lost," he breathed. "It's one we never recorded at all." The void inclined its head in something like approval. The forgotten stories had festered in the darkness beyond the vault's walls, fusing together into this monstrous amalgam of neglected truths. Now it had come to claim its due. Books flew from the shelves in a whirlwind of paper and binding, their pages disintegrating as the void fed on their substance. Elara reached for Alistair's hand as the vault trembled around them. "If we can't preserve it," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos, "then we'll have to experience it." Together, they stepped into the maelstrom of unraveling history, allowing the storm of forgotten truths to tear them apart molecule by molecule, their consciousness dispersing into the collective memory of everything the world had tried so hard to forget. Chapter 55. The village children were the first to notice the change in the old well. Where once its stones had been dry and silent, now a dark liquid seeped from its cracks, not water, but something thicker, richer, that shimmered with strange colors when sunlight struck it at certain angles. Those brave enough to peer into its depths swore they saw shapes moving in the darkness, not reflections, but scenes from lives they'd never lived, places they'd never visited. The town archivist, sorting through neglected documents in the old library, suddenly found herself transcribing passages she didn't recall writing, her hand moving with uncanny certainty as she recorded events that hadn't happened yet. Across the world, historians awoke screaming from dreams of battles they'd never studied, artists painted masterpieces in styles they'd never learned, and in 1,000 quiet bedrooms, people sat bolt upright in the dark, whispering names they'd never been taught. The ink had returned to the world, and with it, all the stories that had been locked away. Somewhere beyond the veil of perception, two figures walked side by side through an endless library, their footsteps silent on the marble floors. "Is this how it ends?" one asked. The other smiled, reaching to adjust a book that had been shelved incorrectly. "No," they said, "this is how it begins." Chapter 56. The ink from the well spread through the town like a living thing, seeping into the cracks between cobblestones, staining the edges of rivers, pulling in the hollows of sleeping children's palms where their fingers curled against the night. People woke with words on their tongues they didn't recognize, phrases in dead languages, fragments of songs no one had sung for centuries. The archivist's hands were permanently stained blue-black now, her fingernails etching faint words into every surface she touched without her realizing. The town's cats followed the ink trails with unusual intensity, their pupils blown wide as they watched things move in the puddles that shouldn't have been able to move at all. In the square where the old well stood, the liquid had begun to evaporate upward in twisting ribbons, forming strange shapes against the sky that some claimed looked like letters from an alphabet no one could read. A delegation from the capital arrived with containment units and hazmat suits, their instruments whirring frantically as they tried to take samples, but the ink slipped through their filters like smoke, reforming in their test tubes into miniature scenes from historical events, except the scientists swore some showed moments that hadn't happened yet, like the strange tableau of their own helicopter crashing on the return trip. The local priest, a pragmatic man who had long since stopped believing in anything supernatural, took one look at the well and immediately began reciting the last rites in perfect Latin, a language he'd never studied. Chapter 57. The first person to fully understand was a 9-year-old girl named Mira who had fallen into the well 3 days prior and emerged completely dry but changed in ways no one could articulate. She sat in the middle of the town square now, surrounded by anxious adults and curious children, drawing in a notebook with a pen that never seemed to run out of ink. Her drawings weren't drawings at all but perfect recreations of historical documents. The Magna Carta, the lost diaries of Empress Wu Zetian, the original score for Beethoven's unfinished 10th Symphony, all rendered with impossible accuracy by a child who'd never had an art lesson in her life. When the archivist knelt beside her and asked in a trembling voice how she knew these things, Mira simply pointed to the well and said, "The librarians told me." No one noticed at first that the shadows around the well had grown longer, sharper, or that they sometimes moved independently of the light. No one remarked on how the town's clocks all ran slightly slow now, the gears grinding as if weighed down by some invisible substance. And certainly no one commented on the fact that whenever 2 or more people gathered near the ink stains, their shadows against the walls would sometimes show extra limbs, hands holding quills, arms reaching for books on high shelves, the distinct outline of someone leaning over a writing desk. The changes were subtle, easy to dismiss, until the morning the town woke to find every mirror reflecting not the person standing before it, but a figure in ink-stained robes bent over some enormous tome, their features obscured but their presence undeniable. That was when the screaming started. Chapter 58. The government officials declared quarantine as the ink spread beyond the town's borders, carried not just by water but by words themselves. People 3 counties away reported finding strange paragraphs inserted into their morning newspapers, passages that described events with terrifying accuracy before they happened. A novelist in Paris woke to find her latest manuscript continued in handwriting not her own, detailing her own death in precise calligraphic strokes. The world's information systems began to falter as inexplicable data corrupted servers, financial records overwritten with epic poems in dead languages, satellite feeds interrupted by what appeared to be library shelves stretching into infinity. Meanwhile, back in the town, Mira had begun speaking exclusively in quotations from books that didn't exist, her voice taking on an eerie harmonic quality as if multiple people were speaking through her at once. The well's opening had expanded overnight, its stones rearranging themselves into something resembling a doorway, through which occasional glimpses could be caught of an endless corridor lined with bookshelves. The few brave souls who approached close enough to peer inside reported seeing figures moving in the distance, some recognizably human, others less so, their forms composed of shifting text. The archivist, now nearly mad from the constant flood of knowledge pouring through her, had taken to writing directly on the walls of her house in a language that burned itself into the plaster before fading away. Her final act before disappearing entirely was to scrawl above the town hall entrance. The stories must be told, but some are not ready to hear. By dusk, the words had rearranged themselves into a simpler message: we are coming. Chapter 59. The world held its breath as the ink tides rose, spilling from every written surface. Newspapers bled onto hands, tattoos crawled off skin, the very letters on historical monuments peeled away from their stone backings to swirl in the air like angry wasps. In the town, the well doorway had stabilized into a perfect arch of black stone, through which figures could now be seen moving with purpose. The first to emerge was a woman no one recognized but somehow everyone knew. Her face appeared simultaneously on every screen, her voice spoke through every radio, her words materialized in the margins of every book. "We are the keepers," she said, though her mouth didn't move, "and we have come to collect what was lost." Behind her, the library stretched away into impossible distances, its shelves bending in directions the human eye couldn't follow, its contents humming with a low, insistent energy. People across the globe reported sudden knowledge flooding their minds: the true name of the first human to tame fire, the exact weight of Alexander the Great's sorrow when he realized there were no more worlds to conquer, the smell of the ink used to sign the Declaration of Independence. The boundaries between past and present dissolved as the library's contents merged with reality. Cities flickered between modern skyscrapers and ancient ruins, people walked briefly beside their own ancestors, every story ever told played out simultaneously in a cacophony of overlapping narratives. Through it all, the keepers moved with calm precision, their inky robes swirling around them as they gently corrected the flow of history, separating myth from fact, restoring forgotten truths, and, most importantly, collecting the new stories being created by the chaos itself. Chapter 60. When the dust settled and the ink finally receded, though it never truly disappeared, you can still find traces of it in the right light. If you know where to look, the world was both exactly the same and completely different. The well in the town square had returned to normal, though its water now had a peculiar bluish tint that scientists couldn't explain. Mira was just an ordinary girl again, though she sometimes woke with fragments of strange poetry on her lips. The archivist was never found, though occasionally librarians report seeing a woman matching her description shelving books in distant corners of the stacks, always gone when they look again. As for the keepers and their library, well, they're still there, just out of sight. You might catch a glimpse of them in the moment between waking and sleep, or in the way shadows sometimes fall just a bit too precisely like letters on a page. The world remembers now, though not always consciously. Historians find their work suspiciously easy some days, as if the information wants to be found. Children's imaginary friends sometimes describe places they couldn't possibly know. And every now and then, if you're very quiet and the light is just right, you can hear the faint sound of pages turning, of pens scratching, of two voices, one warm, one crisp, discussing how best to preserve this particular moment for the ages. The stories never end. They simply wait to be rediscovered. Until the day the anomaly appeared. Alistair noticed it first. A single line of text in an otherwise pristine manuscript that read, "This is not how it happened." The words glowed faintly crimson against the black ink, pulsing with unsettling energy. As he reached to touch the page, the letters rearranged themselves into a new sentence, "You weren't there." Elara looked up from her work, sensing the disturbance in the vault's equilibrium. The books around them began to tremble on their shelves as conflicting narratives battled for dominance within their pages. A first edition account of the fall of Constantinople now contained 3 contradictory versions of the emperor's final moments. A chronicle of the Apollo missions showed Armstrong planting both left and right feet on lunar soil simultaneously. The very air crackled with paradox as the vault's careful order unraveled. "Something's trying to rewrite history," Elara whispered, her fingers tightening around the raven feather quill that had once belonged to the original scribe. Alistair watched in horror as the distortion spread, entire shelves dissolving into swirling clouds of fragmented text. Then came the voice, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, whispering from everywhere and nowhere at once, "You've been careless with my story." Chapter 54. The temperature in the vault plummeted as the entity manifested, not as a figure but as an absence, a human-shaped void where no ink could adhere, no words could take form. It moved through the shelves with terrifying purpose, its passage erasing entire volumes as it went. "We remember everything," Elara protested, placing herself between the creature and their life's work. The void paused, and for the first time, words appeared in its chest, not written but carved, as if some invisible hand had scored them directly into reality. "Remembering is not the same as knowing." Alistair understood first. "It's not a story we lost," he breathed. "It's one we never recorded at all." The void inclined its head in something like approval. The forgotten stories had festered in the darkness beyond the vault's walls, fusing together into this monstrous amalgam of neglected truths. Now it had come to claim its due. Books flew from the shelves in a whirlwind of paper and binding, their pages disintegrating as the void fed on their substance. Elara reached for Alistair's hand as the vault trembled around them. "If we can't preserve it," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos, "then we'll have to experience it." Together, they stepped into the maelstrom of unraveling history, allowing the storm of forgotten truths to tear them apart molecule by molecule, their consciousness dispersing into the collective memory of everything the world had tried so hard to forget. Chapter 55. The village children were the first to notice the change in the old well. Where once its stones had been dry and silent, now a dark liquid seeped from its cracks, not water, but something thicker, richer, that shimmered with strange colors when sunlight struck it at certain angles. Those brave enough to peer into its depths swore they saw shapes moving in the darkness, not reflections, but scenes from lives they'd never lived, places they'd never visited. The town archivist, sorting through neglected documents in the old library, suddenly found herself transcribing passages she didn't recall writing, her hand moving with uncanny certainty as she recorded events that hadn't happened yet. Across the world, historians awoke screaming from dreams of battles they'd never studied, artists painted masterpieces in styles they'd never learned, and in 1,000 quiet bedrooms, people sat bolt upright in the dark, whispering names they'd never been taught. The ink had returned to the world, and with it, all the stories that had been locked away. Somewhere beyond the veil of perception, 2 figures walked side by side through an endless library, their footsteps silent on the marble floors. "Is this how it ends?" one asked. The other smiled, reaching to adjust a book that had been shelved incorrectly. "No," they said, "this is how it begins." Chapter 56. The ink from the well spread through the town like a living thing, seeping into the cracks between cobblestones, staining the edges of rivers, pulling in the hollows of sleeping children's palms where their fingers curled against the night. People woke with words on their tongues they didn't recognize, phrases in dead languages, fragments of songs no one had sung for centuries. The archivist's hands were permanently stained blue-black now, her fingernails etching faint words into every surface she touched without her realizing. The town's cats followed the ink trails with unusual intensity, their pupils blown wide as they watched things move in the puddles that shouldn't have been able to move at all. In the square where the old well stood, the liquid had begun to evaporate upward in twisting ribbons, forming strange shapes against the sky that some claimed looked like letters from an alphabet no one could read. A delegation from the capital arrived with containment units and hazmat suits, their instruments whirring frantically as they tried to take samples, but the ink slipped through their filters like smoke, reforming in their test tubes into miniature scenes from historical events, except the scientists swore some showed moments that hadn't happened yet, like the strange tableau of their own helicopter crashing on the return trip. The local priest, a pragmatic man who had long since stopped believing in anything supernatural, took one look at the well and immediately began reciting the last rites in perfect Latin, a language he'd never studied. Chapter 57. The first person to fully understand was a 9-year-old girl named Mira who had fallen into the well 3 days prior and emerged completely dry but changed in ways no one could articulate. She sat in the middle of the town square now, surrounded by anxious adults and curious children, drawing in a notebook with a pen that never seemed to run out of ink. Her drawings weren't drawings at all but perfect recreations of historical documents. The Magna Carta, the lost diaries of Empress Wu Zetian, the original score for Beethoven's unfinished 10th Symphony, all rendered with impossible accuracy by a child who'd never had an art lesson in her life. When the archivist knelt beside her and asked in a trembling voice how she knew these things, Mira simply pointed to the well and said, "The librarians told me." No one noticed at first that the shadows around the well had grown longer, sharper, or that they sometimes moved independently of the light. No one remarked on how the town's clocks all ran slightly slow now, the gears grinding as if weighed down by some invisible substance. And certainly no one commented on the fact that whenever 2 or more people gathered near the ink stains, their shadows against the walls would sometimes show extra limbs, hands holding quills, arms reaching for books on high shelves, the distinct outline of someone leaning over a writing desk. The changes were subtle, easy to dismiss, until the morning the town woke to find every mirror reflecting not the person standing before it, but a figure in ink-stained robes bent over some enormous tome, their features obscured but their presence undeniable. That was when the screaming started. Chapter 58. The government officials declared quarantine as the ink spread beyond the town's borders, carried not just by water but by words themselves. People 3 counties away reported finding strange paragraphs inserted into their morning newspapers, passages that described events with terrifying accuracy before they happened. A novelist in Paris woke to find her latest manuscript continued in handwriting not her own, detailing her own death in precise calligraphic strokes. The world's information systems began to falter as inexplicable data corrupted servers. Financial records overwritten with epic poems in dead languages, satellite feeds interrupted by what appeared to be library shelves stretching into infinity. Meanwhile, back in the town, Mira had begun speaking exclusively in quotations from books that didn't exist, her voice taking on an eerie harmonic quality as if multiple people were speaking through her at once. The well's opening had expanded overnight, its stones rearranging themselves into something resembling a doorway, through which occasional glimpses could be caught of an endless corridor lined with bookshelves. The few brave souls who approached close enough to peer inside reported seeing figures moving in the distance, some recognizably human, others less so, their forms composed of shifting text. The archivist, now nearly mad from the constant flood of knowledge pouring through her, had taken to writing directly on the walls of her house in a language that burned itself into the plaster before fading away. Her final act before disappearing entirely was to scrawl above the town hall entrance. The stories must be told but some are not ready to hear. By dusk, the words had rearranged themselves into a simpler message: "We are coming." Chapter 59. The world held its breath as the ink tides rose, spilling from every written surface. Newspapers bled onto hands, tattoos crawled off skin, the very letters on historical monuments peeled away from their stone backings to swirl in the air like angry wasps. In the town, the well doorway had stabilized into a perfect arch of black stone, through which figures could now be seen moving with purpose. The first to emerge was a woman no one recognized but somehow everyone knew. Her face appeared simultaneously on every screen, her voice spoke through every radio, her words materialized in the margins of every book. "We are the keepers," she said, though her mouth didn't move, "and we have come to collect what was lost." Behind her, the library stretched away into impossible distances, its shelves bending in directions the human eye couldn't follow, its contents humming with a low, insistent energy. People across the globe reported sudden knowledge flooding their minds: the true name of the first human to tame fire, the exact weight of Alexander the Great's sorrow when he realized there were no more worlds to conquer, the smell of the ink used to sign the Declaration of Independence. The boundaries between past and present dissolved as the library's contents merged with reality. Cities flickered between modern skyscrapers and ancient ruins, people walked briefly beside their own ancestors, every story ever told played out simultaneously in a cacophony of overlapping narratives. Through it all, the keepers moved with calm precision, their inky robes swirling around them as they gently corrected the flow of history, separating myth from fact, restoring forgotten truths, and, most importantly, collecting the new stories being created by the chaos itself. Chapter 60. When the dust settled and the ink finally receded, though it never truly disappeared, you can still find traces of it in the right light. If you know where to look, the world was both exactly the same and completely different. The well in the town square had returned to normal, though its water now had a peculiar bluish tint that scientists couldn't explain. Mira was just an ordinary girl again, though she sometimes woke with fragments of strange poetry on her lips. The archivist was never found, though occasionally librarians report seeing a woman matching her description shelving books in distant corners of the stacks, always gone when they look again. As for the keepers and their library, well, they're still there, just out of sight. You might catch a glimpse of them in the moment between waking and sleep, or in the way shadows sometimes fall just a bit too precisely like letters on a page. The world remembers now, though not always consciously. Historians find their work suspiciously easy some days, as if the information wants to be found. Children's imaginary friends sometimes describe places they couldn't possibly know. And every now and then, if you're very quiet and the light is just right, you can hear the faint sound of pages turning, of pens scratching, of two voices, one warm, one crisp, discussing how best to preserve this particular moment for the ages. The stories never end. They simply wait to be rediscovered.